Hello and welcome to episode 107 of Decentralized Revolution, a podcast from the Libertarian Party, Mises Caucus, and Mises PAC. I'm Aaron Harris. I'm your host. Hope all of you caught episode 106, which aired live this Monday night with Angela McCardle, Brandy Bishop, Michael Heiss, and myself. We're going to be doing those every Monday at 7:30 for the time being. I think you'll enjoy that. Episode 108 coming up soon will be Liam McCollum interviewing Dan McKnight of the Defend the Guard movement. And we had Dan on several months ago, and since then that movement has picked up a lot of steam. They've had some very, I would call them successes, not the ultimate success yet of actually getting it passed and signed by a governor yet, but they've been close. So Liam will talk to Dan about that. My guest today, of course, you know him, Gene Epstein. He's on our advisory board for the Mises Caucus. He was at Barron's Magazine for a long time. He's just one of those guys who has been around the libertarian movement forever, knows Austrian economics inside and out, and we always enjoy talking to him. He was at our inaugural Take Human Action tour stop back in April in New York City, and we just love Gene. So had a lot a debate he just did with I think the guy's name is Andrew Koppelman, who wrote a book kind of some of the standard criticisms of libertarianism that we're all tired of hearing that Gene did a good job on. We will link to that debate on decentralizedrevolution.com/107. Other stuff that we talk about in this episode with Gene will be on that page. Decentralizedrevolution.com/107. I think I may have inaccurately said that this episode was going to be 106. So if I do that during my talk with Gene, just disregard that and go to /107 for the show notes for this page. And enjoy spending an hour or so with Gene Epstein. Just start with telling us about the debate that you just had. We're taping this on May 24th, and I think it was a couple of days ago. You had a debate about what sounded like a pretty interesting topic. So tell us about the topic and how it went.
Well, I had heard about the book by Northwestern law professor Andrew Koppelman about attacking libertarianism. And since he was getting a fair amount of play, even on libertarian podcasts, I thought I'd challenge him to a debate. And so he readily said yes. And he's an affable guy. He showed up to defend a pretty sweeping resolution about the corruption of libertarians with greed, delusion, disdain for the weak, a whole bill of particulars about how we're thoroughly corrupted. And I realized that the only way to really counter it would be to defend my own resolution, that the government is really corrupted by delusion, greed, and disdain for the weak, and indifference to human life and liberty, and that libertarians have a special message about that. And as I said to the audience, I'm not here to convert you to libertarianism, only here to tell you that if you're not a libertarian, at least we libertarians should be listened to, since we do bring your attention to all the ways in which the government is indeed troubled in those various regards. I went over, I latched upon items that Koppelman had mentioned in his own book, having to do with the COVID, where he was defending the government. His brief mention of government's wars, which I pointed out was inadequate, and noted that the president that he thinks is the best compromise between Hayekian libertarianism and reality is Barack Obama. Barack Obama, I pointed out, is a major war criminal.
Right.
So he shouldn't be championing him. And then we went to welfare state. I mean, I could go over some of the issues we discussed. He was pretty much floored by my attack. And so it was sort of like a little bit of a rout, because as he kept saying that maybe Gene has a point about libertarianism, I wasn't really addressing that form of libertarianism. Well, okay, but you're taking on libertarianism in general, and here I am libertarians point this out. I should mention what's interesting is that we had an after party, as we always do, and he stuck around. He then walked up to me. I was sitting on a couch, and it's around 11 o'clock, like 2.5 hours into our after party, and he wants to talk about this. And he said, what's the general point of it you were making? How does all this fit in? And I gave him a somewhat inadequate answer. I said, well, all these things I was protesting against are attacks against what I prefer to call the zero aggression principle. I could have couched it in a different way. I could have said that, well, we libertarians point out that if you're going to, at least the minarchists don't necessarily believe that taxation is always theft, but the minarchist libertarians certainly believe that if you're going to tax people or via the Federal Reserve, as I pointed out in my debate, the Federal Reserve doesn't tax people, it prints money, it preempts resources by printing money and financing the government that way. If you're going to do that, then you bear a very heavy burden of proof that you're doing some good rather than doing harm. And all these activities that I listed are doing extreme harm, damage to life and liberty. So that was my major framework.
So so a little background. So this is Andrew Koppelman. His book is called Burning Down the House, How Libertarian Philosophy Was Corrupted by Delusion and Greed. And I think it was reviewed in the Atlantic a few months ago. I guess it came out in October of 22.
Really? Was it favorably? I mean, I guess favorably reviewed in the Atlantic. Huh?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So I saw it there and some other, and I kind of glanced at it, and it seemed like the typical sort of, I'm 47 years old. So like people older than me, my age and older, a lot of us came to libertarianism kind of through Ayn Rand, and at least we're aware of her. And so I think a lot of people are, my whole life, every time, I'm a libertarian, it's, you're a Randian cult member, and you think, the businessman is basically God and all that stuff. And so it seems like from the blurb I'm seeing on Amazon and those reviews I read, it's kind of the same tropes he seems to be doing. So it's like the blurb on the book is Koppelman traces libertarianism's evolution from Hayek's moderate pro-market ideas to the romantic fabulism of Murray Rothbard, Robert Nozick, and Ayn Rand, and Charles Koch's promotion of climate change denial. So I mean, you and I both know that, Rothbard, Nozick, Rand, and Koch, that's a very wide range of different things there. And some of them, Rand specifically said she was not a libertarian.
Yes.
So it seems to me he has a very surface, Hayek. I like Hayek. I heard of Hayek. He won the Nobel Prize. He's got some interesting things to say. So libertarianism is good, but this guy doesn't seem to know much about neither, what libertarianism actually is today or kind of the roots of it. If you just think Hayek is the only guy.
Well, no, you and I guess if you and I were to sort out those various figures, you made some good points. I have to say that as far as I gather, with respect to Ayn Rand, obviously, I usually defend Ayn Rand, pointing out that she had, characters who were crony capitalists in her novels, so she wasn't always just approving of every business person as some kind of god. She obviously was very impressed by pure entrepreneurial business people and creative innovators, but she understood the evils of crony capitalism. On the other hand, if we were to dwell on Ayn Rand, I gather she was a little bit of a denialist when it came to any kind of environmental externality. She tended to imply that it's always true and non-existent, whereas Rothbard's argument was that it's definitely a tort, a harm, and it is an offense against the non-aggression principle, and therefore it should be adjudicated by the courts. But let me give you my perspective and recognize this. It was indeed, the book was a real morass of issues and confusions, and I guess it'd be interesting for you and I to sort those out. There was a 2-part review, by the way, by David Gordon of the Mises Institute, and I thought that David really lost it a bit. Much as I respect him and I read him pretty faithfully, he was way too impressed by the Koppelman's book. But what I decided to do before this audience was to go strictly for the consequentialism. Simply say that we libertarians have a list of particulars that we are especially sensitive to the evils of government, and we can tell you, whether you're a libertarian or not, that so much of what government does offends almost anybody, should offend almost anybody, whether you're a libertarian or not. And so with respect to the Federal Reserve, for example, I was able to point out that ironically, the Reserve does a lot of good when in fact, and then on the other hand, he's a champion of Hayek. And when Hayek, as I said, had won the Nobel Prize, partly because he pointed out that the Federal Reserve causes boom and bust, causes business cycles. So I was able to point that out. With respect to the Federal Reserve, I actually said, for example, that let's say you're a small d Democrat. Doesn't it trouble you that the government, in your view, in your fantasy, only raises money through taxes or through borrowing against future taxes, but the Federal Reserve is an efficient mechanism whereby it could simply print the money, just has access to the public purse without any being answerable to the people at all. So even if you're not a libertarian, but just a small d Democrat, isn't that deeply offensive and upsetting? And so that was really the main tenor of my argument, the consequentialism of what government does, rather than talking about first principles. I did indeed take Koppelman on with respect to climate change. And in that case, again, I had a strategy. We had hosted Stephen Koonin. Stephen Koonin is a climate scientist at NYU, and he's written a book called Unsettled, which I highly recommend to all. He was an appointee in the Obama administration, and he has called himself a lifelong Democrat with a capital D. But he argued at the Soho Forum that the greenhouse gas emission limitation program is immoral. He's sensitive to it as well. I could have quoted Dawn Lumberg, who's basically a social democrat, who's also pointed out that this is a war. The climate change alarmists are waging war against the poor people of the world. And then on top of that, I pointed out that the non-libertarian leaders of China and India and of the African nations are not going along with it. As much as they may pay lip service to the climate change alarmists, they are financing full tilt, the coal mines. India is buying oil from Russia like there's no tomorrow. So therefore, they're not deluded into thinking that they can abandon fossil fuels and follow the lead of their masters in North America. So again, that was my strategy. When you set up a debate, you have a limited amount of time to make the arguments. And so that's pretty much the tack that I took. And I won substantially in terms of Oxford-style voting, but that in itself is not such a crucial point.
Yeah.
In any case, yeah.
Well, I always, from being a libertarian, so I became a libertarian when I actually read Rothbard first before I kind of got into Rand and was sort of.
What Rothbard did you? See, my exposure was Man, Economy, and State. What was your exposure?
For a New Liberty.
Oh, okay. Very good book to begin with.
Yeah. I had actually heard Walter Williams, who was guest hosting on the Rush Limbaugh show. I was kind of a Reagan Democrat. Well, my dad was a Reagan Democrat, and my family was. So I was kind of a Reagan kid in the 80s.
Reagan Democrat, that's good. I'm sorry. So you're now 47, you said?
Yeah. So my dad grew up, he's a baby boomer and was from the South and was an auto worker. So like kind of the classic, sort of socially conservative Democrat. But, Reagan kind of gave all those people, because, people from the South, Kentucky, Tennessee, where all my people are from, like a lot of people did not vote Republican basically because of the Civil War, right? So like still 100 years later or
the Dixiecrats.
More. Yeah. So, so they kind of became a Republican voter. And then I kind of liked Reagan as a kid and was listening to Rush Limbaugh, and I liked the more libertarian stuff. And it was always, Reagan's libertarian rhetoric that I liked the most. And then so I'm listening to Rush, and every once in a while he would have on this guy, Walter Williams. And I was like, oh, this guy's even better.
Mm.
And he talked about, I'm sure you'll remember this. A lot of people don't. It was a business called Laissez-Faire Books. And I think they had an actual bookstore at one time. But they were basically a catalog. It was like a catalog and newsprint that you could send away this is before the internet, and had all these, had Mises and Rand and Rothbard and Nozick and all kinds of people. And so I was like, and so it said, okay, what's this libertarian stuff? For a New Liberty is a great intro to it. So I ordered that, and the rest is history.
I'm counting. Yeah. So let's see. So let's see now. You must have 47. So what? You were born in 1977?
75. End of 75, yeah.
And then, so then how, what year? Oh, so actually, it's funny, the original For New Liberty actually, interestingly, went through a rewrite. The initial version published in 73 was not quite as good or robust. It was good, but it wasn't quite as brilliant as a version that Murray Rothbard rewrote a few years later. Mm-hmm. So obviously, so this book came out just about when you were born.
Yeah.
So then you read it. How old were you when you read it?
I would have been
looking for your copy.
18, 19. I think I actually have it here somewhere.
Yeah, so you read. What's interesting about that book as well is that he's getting his copy off the wall. Go ahead.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, that's it. There it is. Yeah. Well, that's the version where Rothbard actually strikes a sort of opportunistic note and associates libertarianism with what I usually do when I talk to people, which is to associate it with the American Revolution most directly. So to sort of like play that card and point out, look, 90% of what the Declaration of Independence and even the U.S. Constitution, the whole movement, Tom Paine and the rest of them are all about was libertarianism. And that's very good. But with respect to the Laissez-Faire Bookshop, see, in my case, let's see, I was 28 or 29 in 1944. So therefore, we're talking about the late 1960s. Let's see. Like 71, 72. Even before he wrote For a New Liberty, I picked up Man, Economy, and State in the library of the New School, graduate school where I was going. I was teaching economics at the time, and that was the book that set me going. Interestingly, not so much because of libertarianism, but because of the clarity of its with respect to economics, mm-hmm. and how he often digressed to talk about the problems with the mainstream. So that really set me going. And at that time, the Laissez-Faire Bookshop was a bricks and mortar bookshop on Mercer Street. As a matter of fact, I now live a few blocks away from Mercer Street, where there still is a bookshop, although it's a used bookshop. It's not in that same location. It's not the Laissez-Faire. So I lived on the Upper West Side, and I was a big bicyclist. I would bike down virtually every weekend and browse and buy a couple of books. So for over the next several years, I pretty much read my way through the canon, but I didn't order it through a catalog. I was able to buy it through the bricks and mortar bookshop. And so I segued from Austrian economics into libertarianism. And that was my conversion. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, just today, I tweeted that when people ask me to recommend books about libertarianism, I usually have sort of eclectically recommended a few different tomes, some of them more recent. But then about a year ago, I picked up Man, Economy, and State again, and I was caught up by just the obvious fact that just about nobody could match Rothbard for passion, clarity, mm-hmm. cogency, and force of its arguments. And even though the book is of course rooted in the 1970s, and its empirical data are all very much of that time, obviously, even though its facts are dated, I still think it's probably the best book to recommend. If there's any one book, and there are many ways in, it's always unpredictable. My way in was Man, Economy, and State, remarkably. But that's probably the best bet for most people that particular book.
And I always think that Rothbard, it was always about both the practical and the moral to me. Like he was always like, it's wrong that government does this to these people. And not only is it wrong, but it usually almost always leads to, worse outcomes. Libertarianism does not give us a perfect world, but it's always, compared to what? And like back then, and then I wasn't like in the movement really much until maybe about 2010. A little before that was when I kind of got involved with the Libertarian Party and just more in general online and things like that. And I don't think I've ever met anybody in 15 plus years in the movement, and I'm almost 30 years now as a libertarian, who was like, oh, I'm a libertarian because I love rich people. And I think rich businessmen should run the show. Like every libertarian I know is because the government did something to them or their family, or they're just outraged at, cops shooting people, or, just it's concern for justice, and usually the little guy in some sense. Like I've never heard anybody like, man, Walmart just gets screwed by the government, and that's why I'm a libertarian.
Well, I will say a couple of things that first of all, with respect to your point about fundamental values and practicality, I would call it rights and consequentialism. Mm-hmm. It really, with respect to the consequentialist aspect of things, it's important for us to recognize the following. I was talking to a religious Christian recently and saying, I guess maybe from a libertarian point of view, the best one good practical argument for God is that God could have said, I'm going to create this system called capitalism, and it will be essential to human liberty, but it will also promote poverty. And so that if you become a capitalist, you're going to be exploiting people and rendering them poor, even though it does promote liberty. I mean, if you can imagine that contradiction. So no, but God decrees no. Capitalism promotes liberty and prosperity for the broad masses of people. My point being that if the argument is, and that's of course gets back to the debate I had the other night, if the argument is, yeah, look, it's fine to talk about liberty, but isn't liberty mostly for you smart people, and liberty is valuable? Yes, but look at all the awful things that liberty produces. Mm-hmm. Don't you people recognize that if it's going to impoverish people, if it's going to end in slaughter, if it's going to mean that we're heating up the planet to the point that we're destroying it, if all of those bad things result, how can you be so blind as to say that the only thing that matters is liberty? Now, in fact, they're correct. The liberty is not the only thing that matters. And if capitalism impoverished people, then I would be on the horns of a dilemma, as I imagine you would be. And so that's the reason why the consequentialist argument is very important. Yeah. And the other night when he mentioned Rothbard, Koppelman, my opponent in the debate, mentioned Rothbard somewhat disparagingly, I said, one of the best consequentialist books is For a New Liberty. Rothbard does take on the consequences of the state and of capitalism and makes all of those arguments. And that's the reason why we libertarians do have an obligation to talk in consequentialist terms. Although, here's something interesting. I'm going to Porcfest, Porcupine Festival. I should promote that a little bit. What's interesting is I was told that they usually sell out. Porcupine Festival, as you probably know, Aaron. Have you ever been up there?
I have not, and I'm not going to be able to make it this year either. It seems like it always something else is going on, but I know a lot of Mises people are going to be up there. So,
well, that's good. Well, let me take a moment to promote it a little bit among whoever's listening to this podcast. It's the June 19th to the 25th. It's up in Lancaster, New Hampshire. In this multi-acre area, I know it's like hundreds and hundreds of acres. It's quite an experience. I will be up there for the third time, and this time I'm going to be doing moderating a debate, participating in a debate, and also doing a workshop on the abuse of data. And it's a very, very lively sort of like I mentioned progressive friends of mine. Think in terms of sort of Woodstock back in the 1960s.
Oh yeah,
it's filled with libertines, dumb, crazy things like the nude Olympics. A bunch of guys and a few women doing Olympics, absolutely stark naked. Crazy shit going on in different areas of it. But if you don't want to go to the nude Olympics, I was not too eager to go, but I was dragooned into attending briefly, and it wasn't really my thing. But I mean, that's an example of what goes on there. However, there are a lot of other good events. Getting to the events I'm going to be involved with to try to lure people to coming is this. The one that relates to consequentialism is that I'm going to be debating David Friedman. David is indeed, an icon of the libertarian movement. He's written some very good works. Machinery of Freedom is his classic work, and he came up with some good lines. A better writer than his father, Milton Friedman, actually. And one of his good lines is that we libertarians believe that every man has a right to go to hell in his own fashion.
Well, you know where that comes from.
Where's that?
Well, it's in Deadwood season 1.
Oh, yeah.
Wild Bill says to the other guy,
yeah.
Seth Bullock, like, won't you let me go to hell the way I want to? And then I think it probably also comes from like Huckleberry Finn, where Huckleberry Finn's told he needs to have certain attitudes toward the slave Jim, and he's like, well, if that's what I have to do and they say, well, to be a good Christian, you have to, look down on slaves. He's like, well, all right, then I'll go to hell then. That's interesting. I'll have to look that up to see.
I've got a trivia correction for you, Aaron. Watch it in the future.
Yeah.
I realized the actor who plays Wild Bill Hickok doesn't say that to Seth Bullock, who's brilliantly played by what's his face, Timothy
Oliphant. Yeah.
No, he says that to Charlie Utter.
Oh,
Charlie Utter is his pal who's trying to take care of him. Remember?
That's right.
Got you there. Okay, Aaron, you're freezing up. What's the story? Your image is freezing up. Are you still hearing me, Aaron? Hello.
I think we had a little hiccup there of my internet.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Well, of course, the Deadwood series came out years after David wrote that line.
Okay, so
but maybe he got it from Huckleberry Finn. My only point is this: I'm being a little bit verbose in setting this up.
That's fine.
David has done a series of interviews and also in his writings in which he basically argues that what I prefer to call the zero aggression principle after Gerard Casey's inspiration. Yep. I like the word zero rather than non-aggression principle. But he's argued that the non-aggression principle is incoherent and useless. David argues. David likes to call himself would call himself 100% consequentialist. That the arguments from consequentialism are more than sufficient to convince anybody of libertarianism. And so he's made this argument a number of times. He's put it in his book, and I thought, since David is a great debater and interesting guy, I thought that this year I would challenge him on that point. I do believe that any argument with respect to consequentialism, my favorite one is actually free trade. I think it's an easy, good example. Any argument, including the argument about legalizing drugs, or with any of those arguments, should be anchored ultimately in the argument for the non-aggression principle. That because all consequentialist and empirical arguments are essentially, ultimately, somewhat conjectural, or some of them are a little bit empty. I will go into that one because that, just to give you a preview, in debating David, I'm going to argue that David has made all these arguments for free trade, and so there's the gains from trade. And isn't it obvious that if one country specializes in what it does best, and another country specializes in what it does best, and they trade, then they will have gains from trade. If one country's not that good at producing widgets, but they're good at producing semiconductors, that's what they should specialize in and trade those semiconductors for widgets. So you get more output as a result. But a cynic would say, what is that? That's just for economists to talk about. So people get materially better off. But what about all the widget producers who get laid off? What about all those lost jobs? All those towns that get shut down potentially because of foreign competition? And ultimately, then the gains from trade argument is useful, but it's not decisive. What's ultimately decisive is that you and I have a right to spend our money as we see fit, and if we want to buy from abroad, we have a right to do so. Anybody who intervenes, who is essentially going to force us to buy a product that we don't want to buy, is violating the non-aggression principle. And although with that said, plenty of us will buy domestically if we think it's a good idea. My favorite example is that 25 years after World War II, full 25, the Jews were not buying German cars.
Yep.
Maybe they were good cars, but I don't want to buy from a German. Well, you don't always maximize your utility when you're a consumer. My father, for 25 years, he wouldn't buy a German car, and then he was only buying American, because of the same kind of and with respect to his cars. So people do that. Well, my point is that all arguments have to be grounded in the zero aggression principle ultimately when it comes. So therefore, consequentialism always partly is essentially dependent on values. So I'm going to be debating David. I'll tell you, I'm also going to begin with a great story about David. There's a new 900-page biography of Milton Friedman that's come out, although it's not been published. My son read it and sent me a passage. David is interviewed about growing up with his father, and he literally says that it wasn't until he was a senior in high school that it began to occur to him that not all discussions consist of a debate. He thought anytime you talk, you're debating. And this was David at the age of 16 or 17. Still, and then at the dinner table, you would always, at the end of the discussion, you'd always flash a 0 to 9. 0 if you concede, 9 if you think you won. So this is essentially. So I'm up against a guy who debated Milton Friedman, his own dad, until he was 17 years old. So anyway, I'm just trying to advertise. Why don't you come to Porcfest and hear my debate with David? Yeah. And there's going to be another debate. Jeremy Kaufman is going to be debating Matt Kibbe. Jeremy is going to be defending the resolution. It is easier to convert you know the one you heard of it?
I think I heard it, but I'm going to let you say it.
Easier to convert a heterosexual to homosexuality than it is to convert a non-libertarian to libertarianism. And so this is the extreme view of the Free State Project. And of course, it's a little bit conjectural ultimately, but during its summer, so we have conjectural debates. The Free State people believe, obviously, that libertarianism is always going to be a minority view. And so the best thing for us to do is to congregate in New Hampshire. Where do you live, Aaron?
I live in, thankfully, now Knoxville, Tennessee. The last time we talked a couple of years ago, Dayton, Ohio. So we escaped to the relatively free state of Tennessee.
We're talking about you and you have a wife?
My wife, yep.
Any kids?
Nope, not yet.
No kids.
We both we got started late.
I see. And you lost your southern accent somewhere along the way.
Well, it's funny. So I grew up in Dayton, Ohio. My dad was born in Kentucky, and all my grandparents one of my grandparents was from down here in Tennessee, the other all from Eastern Kentucky. So I don't have an accent really, but I went to grad school at Northwestern, and I said something. I don't know what I said. I think I said, I reckon I'm going to go do something. So I still have some Southern ways of speech. And the guy looked at me. He's like, are you from like Texas or Tennessee or something? He was some rich kid from like New York or whatever. So yeah, I'm only generation born north of the Mason-Dixon line. So
well, it gets back to my favorite point about how kids are really influenced by their peers in their environment much more than their parents. My wife is Japanese. She raised her kids in New York, and and mostly, of course, they heard heavily accented English and Japanese from their mother, but of course they talk like New Yorkers. You imitate. So if you grew up in Ohio, you start by imitating your peers much more than you imitate your parents with their Southern accent. And that so you went to Northwestern, which is where Koppelman teaches in the law school, and you got some kind of degree there. What?
Yeah, I got a master's in journalism about almost exactly 20 years ago. And I was a newspaper reporter for a little while, and very quickly decided that whole industry is doomed and corrupt. And so, so I got out of that, but yeah.
And so then so you do this, and then how do you, mostly your daily bread comes from earning?
Yeah, so I've been a freelance editor for the last several years. I edited Scott Horton's Enough Already, Dave Benner's book on Tom Paine, or a couple of projects that people listening to this would know. Mostly I do stuff for like college textbooks and test materials and things like that. I work for a couple of companies that they contract with the big educational publishers. And so, yeah, so I've edited stuff from, high school literature textbooks to, graduate level accounting test modules and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Oh, fascinating! I see. And Scott is I have Scott Horton's book in the rough manuscript having to do called what's it
Provoked.
Provoked, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. He's been talking about it on, I think he was on Tom Woods the other day. Yeah. It's about the Russia-Ukraine thing. So I wanted to get your take on some current economic things too while I've got you, because
so there's going to be the tough questions, but go ahead. Yes.
Well, yeah, but you're the guy, right?
I'm the guy to give you it on the one hand and the other hand, but go ahead. Yes.
Well, it's like earlier you said that the Friedmans, David Friedman said, I didn't know that not every conversation was a debate. Well, isn't there a joke about something like, 4 Jews, 6 opinions, something like that, right?
Oh, of course. Yeah. No, indeed. Remember, as two Jews, you get 3 opinions, but you could double it to 6. Yeah,
it's almost the same way with economists, right? Because on the one hand, on the other hand. But so all along, I've been, the last few years with it's something that normal people talk about, inflation, how much stuff costs. And as a, someone who knows about the business cycle, we've been, even before COVID, we're like, hey, is this sustainable? When is the crash going to come? And I know that, knowing Austrian business cycle theory doesn't allow you to predict exactly when things are going to happen and the precipitating event that's going to do it. It's just eventually you will have a crash and a readjustment, and the boom and the bust has to happen. So if you were at a dinner party and a normal person finds out you're an economist and is like, is the economy in trouble? Why does stuff cost so much? What would your answer be right now?
The economy is in trouble, and we definitely. I mean, a few things I can be reasonably sure of. So that's why I do invite people to follow me on Twitter. I'm at scribble this down, or maybe you can post it at Gene Soho Forum is my Twitter handle, at Gene Soho Forum.
I'll have it. I'll post the link, and then the links to the Soho Forum stuff and the Porcfest is all going to be up on decentralizedrevolution.com/106.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So the few things that I'm sure of course, is that number one, we are in a classic sort of stagflation. I look at, and I will use conventional measures. I covered the conventional data for basically for 30 years, 26 of those years at Barron's, and years prior to that at the New York Stock Exchange. And I think the conventional measures are of use. And according to private sector GDP measure, which you can do, because a lot of people don't like the government being involved in GDP, you can know private sector GDP, simple enough calculation to to take the private sector or the complete GDP number in real terms as it's inflation adjusted. We've been at like 1% growth, and with inflation, so that is stagflation. That's for sure. The second thing that I have to remind people of is that definitely the price inflation that we've been going through, although this isn't necessarily just Austrian business cycle theory. Milton Friedman could have pointed this out as well. The monetarists, who were not really Austrians, could have pointed this out. We had a huge explosion in Treasury debt starting in early 2020. Most of it was, of course, the huge explosion in fiscal spending in response to the lockdowns, because obviously the economy was forced into shutting down, and that explosion in Treasury spending, which is documentable easily enough, caused this explosion in debt, and the Treasury debt, was taken up by the Federal Reserve. There too, the conventional numbers show that you have a spike in the Treasury debt held by the Federal Reserve, and when the Federal Reserve picks up Treasury debt in the trillions, it does it through printing money, and so the money printing then resulted in the price inflation that we've been experiencing. It was not, as the progressives like to argue, it was not. It's not corporate greed. It's not corporate profits. And I pointed out a number of times on my Twitter handle that corporate profits are actually they're on the high side, but in fact, corporate profit margins were highest in the 1950s and 60s, or during periods of relatively low price inflation. Where the corporate profit margins now are noticeably below where they were in the 50s and 60s. They're slightly elevated, but not that high in relation to recent periods over the last 10 years when price inflation was pretty tame. And so there's no way to empirically attribute it to corporate profits, much less, of course, empirically attributed to corporations taking the initiative to charge more. If you charge more, you're going to price yourself out of the market, unless, of course, there's been an expansion in the money supply. So that's, of course, I'm just trying to duck your point and try to say, no. Yeah. I'm not always saying on the one hand and the other hand. I'm trying to say there are specific things that we can talk about what we do know. Okay, we also know that that the Federal Reserve is essentially a Soviet planning system, a price fixing system for the most important price of all in the market economy, the price of credit. And we don't know at any one time, although there's been attempts to estimate what it would be. We don't know at any one time what the actual price of credit would be in an uninhibited market economy. We can only make vague guesses about that. The Taylor rule was an attempt to do so. Taylor rule associated with John Taylor of Stanford University, however, it was imperfect. But we do know, of course, that it's very unlikely that it was practically zero.
Right.
And so that the short-term interest rate, and why I mentioned practically zero, because that's been pretty much where the Federal Reserve has been maintaining it. And then we have all kinds of scary indications that it was practically zero. And then if we look at all the accumulation of debt and all the potential for malinvestment, then perhaps David Stockman and Peter Schiff are right. Now I'm going to get into the ambiguity. But anyway, I've gone over a lot of things. I can get to the next part about my ambiguity. But do you have any questions or comments about what I've said so far?
No, I guess one thing is like how long the interest rates have been so low. Like, again, you talk about, we don't really know what the normal interest rate, the market interest rate would be. Like, I remember, I think my parents bought their first, maybe second house in either the late 70s, early 80s. I think it was like right when the Volcker stuff, like I think the interest rate on that house was like 20% or whatever because of, and they had to put down like, 40% down or something like that.
Really?
And like, so we live in this, in my adult life, like the interest rate has been really low to practically zero.
Yeah.
And like, so maybe a critic of, or someone skeptical of the Austrian business cycle theory would be like, look, well, it's been this long for this low for this long. And you're not seeing now, this might be a softball question, but like, how are they not having busts way more often if they're keeping it so artificially low for such a long time?
Well, indeed. Well, okay. Now you get into my problem with Peter Schiff and David Stockman, who are the two most vocal types, and there are others as well, who they're just constantly gaining attention for themselves by predicting year in and year out an imminent collapse. And that's giving Austrian theorists such as myself a bad name, free market people a bad name. They are stopped clocks.
Right.
Tom Woods had me on with David Stockman and has since forgiven me for attacking David by saying, I said to David, you've been predicting it every damn year. David denied it, but I had the goods on him. He had that one dishonest moment. Just look him up, and you'll see he gets on TV all the time. He's predicting a disaster, and he said, "Oh, I never put a timing on that." Yes, you did, David, and Peter Schiff does too. So therefore, it's a little bit silly for us to keep predicting this thing when the conventional numbers show that it doesn't happen that often. And there's nothing that complicated about that. The part of it is that it's foolish for us to argue that this is a strictly sort of top-down Soviet planning style system. There is often a lot of good, healthy entrepreneurial energy in the marketplace. And while I think we do have minor booms and busts that are sort of Austrian related, there's often a lot of other strength in the economy that compensates for it. I'll tell you an interesting story about Milton Friedman, because this does get back to the point you are touching on. I used to call him up like 2 or 3 times a year just to chat with him when I was a columnist at Barron's. And at one point, he told me why he felt he could refute Austrian business cycle theory. And he literally said to me, wouldn't you imagine that if Austrian business cycle theory makes sense, that the strength of a boom would be symmetric with the collapse, with the degree of a bust? That if you have a strong boom, you're going to get a very noticeable bust. That the economy jumps up by 7%, you're going to get a collapse of 7%. Like they're going to be symmetric with each other. And I said politely that I didn't see that at all. Apart from measurement problems with respect to measuring booms and busts, the data are very imperfect anyway. But even assuming no measurement problems, the fact is that lots of booms, lots of expansions have healthy aspects to them.
Right.
Getting back to your, I was going to mention your point about worshiping the rich. I don't worship the rich, but I am really, I mean, a lot of progressives are impressed by Steve Jobs. All of these entrepreneurs who came from nowhere, from Jeff Bezos to Steve Jobs to Sam Walton, these are, and even indeed Elon Musk, these are people I do admire. And they have brought about, they have functioned as legitimate entrepreneurs even in this economy. So we do have an entrepreneurial economy. And so that hopefully explains why we don't necessarily get a bust all the time, as much as the Federal Reserve is attempting to cause a bust. I could talk about why I ultimately defend Austrian business cycle theory, because there are often a lot of good objections, potentially good objections raised to it. But briefly, people ask, if it's caused by setting the interest rates too low, which cause malinvestment, why do businessmen get confused? Why don't businessmen begin to adjust for it and anticipate for it? Well, obviously, By the way, I believe that to some extent they would if they all read Austrian business cycle theory. The vast majority of business people don't know too much about it, and they tend to think that Bernanke and the Federal Reserve are managing things okay. There are John Allison he was head of the Cato Institute for a bit. He was running a major bank. He was sensitive to what was happening with respect to the housing bubble, and he did manage to steer his bank through it. So therefore, I believe that if bankers and business people really were aware of Austrian business cycle theory, then the booms and the busts would be milder. So they asked that question, or they asked questions like, well, aren't there other potential causes of Austrian business cycles? Well, potentially there are. If consumers suddenly became ascetic next week, and we cut our spending back by 30% and decided to try to live like monks, then there would be a huge jolt to the consumer industry, and there would be layoffs and bankruptcies. What is a bust? A bust is a convergence of bankruptcies, and that could happen, but it's not likely to happen. By the way, I also wrote for the American Enterprise Institute when the business cycle of 2020 occurred, the downturn of 2020, I called that a non-Austrian downturn, and I quoted Murray Rothbard. Rothbard specifically wrote in the book The Great Depression, where he set up the theory of the business cycle, and he talked about it, applying it to the Great Depression of the 1930s. He said there are downturns that aren't necessarily caused by Austrian, don't always have Austrian causes. And he said, sometimes the king goes crazy. Well, in 2020, the king went crazy, just simply shut down all business. So I said, once they lift the lockdown, there is going to be a fairly quick recovery, as indeed there was. I'm trying to emphasize what I actually believe, but then I want to mention one other related point, which is this. If we look back on the business cycles since 1970, we had a severe one in the mid-70s. We had another severe one in the early 80s. Then we had a mild recession in 1991, another mild one in 2001. Then we had the Great Recession in 2008-09, a very severe, most severe recession since the Great Depression. And I believe that even with the benefit of hindsight, I don't see how any of us Austrians, can explain that pattern. Why was it severe? Why did it become moderate? Why did it become severe again? And so that's, of course, setting up my excuse for saying that I'm not sure. I'm not sure how bad it's going to be this time. I've spoken with some of my colleagues at Barron's and others who aren't necessarily all Austrians, but they're pretty good at looking at recessions. And some of them think that we're going to muddle through this one, that basically the stagflation is going to persist, but there won't be a crash, and that's not going to astonish me. The data are insufficient to explain what goes on. There are healthy aspects to a boom. There are all kinds of quirks about what goes in the economy that accounts for what goes on, and therefore I won't be surprised either way. And in that way, of course, ultimately, now I'm copping out on your question. Will it be the mother of all busts? Yes, possibly. Might it not be? Might it simply be 1% growth continuing for another couple of years? That's possible too.
Yeah. We got a little more, if you have a little more time, I wanted to ask you about, especially someone with more experience and who's been around longer, RFK running for president, RFK Jr. Yeah. I was talking to Mike Heiss on the phone.
Yeah.
I think yesterday, or maybe it was Monday, but anyway, we're talking about, there's maybe in a slightly different world, or maybe even in this one, there's a kind of a potential for him to have something like a Ron Paul effect on the Democratic Party in terms of like bringing it back to some of its, supposed roots. Like we know the Republican Party has, never really been fully libertarian at all, and only certain strains of it, maybe the Taft Republicans back whenever. But like, calling out some of their basic core values and rallying some people to that. So like, do you see, RFK Jr. reminds me of like the professors I had in college who were like old school 60s liberal Democrats who were really good on civil liberties and war, even as they were really bad on economics and other things. And so I wish that there were still a strain of Democrats, or that the Democrat Party was mainly that. I'd rather have them be good on a couple of things than what they are now, which is bad, really bad on everything. But like, what do you think of that? In context, what you've seen with the Democratic Party over time, and what do you think of RFK's candidacy? And then you can go into the larger presidential election as a whole, if you want. Yeah.
Oh, sure. Okay. Well, I'm not the best person to ask, but about that. But I do think that there's an argument always for voting for the lesser evil, and RFK Jr. is definitely the lesser evil compared to Biden. No comparison at all. And I completely agree with you that, and I think that I've come to admire Dave Smith a lot, by the way. I hope he runs, although I gather he probably won't, on a Libertarian Party ticket, because indeed the compromises that we want to make in with respect to politics are something that Dave readily points out. I mentioned Dave as well because I was unable to listen to the entire interview he did with RFK Jr. because RFK Jr. in his initial response, I don't know, did you listen to that?
I haven't listened yet, but
what's funny is that Dave clearly wanted to give him a nice softball interview, and because he likes him, that's the point. Dave is his rock-willed ANCAP, as I mentioned that, and yet he wants to say good things about RFK Jr. and show him off to proper advantage. But the joke was, I was unable to make it through because the initial answer that he gave to Dave, just saying, "Did you expect to run for president?" No, I didn't expect to run for president. And then the next thing you know, RFK Jr. is going into a long story about how he associates himself with FDR's statement about the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And then he invokes his father. He goes through a whole litany about the great tradition of the Democratic Party. And I thought it was kind of funny that this is his way of appealing to Dave Smith's audience to invoke the great FDR, and he should have saved that for an interview for debating Joe Biden.
Right.
That I'm the true spirit of FDR and of John F. Kennedy and of JFK. John Fitzgerald. By the way, I also want to say that RFK Jr. is coming to Porcfest. So is Vivek Ramaswamy. And then the funny part is that, somewhat funny, if you find guns funny, is that he's demanded that when he speaks at the pavilion that there be no guns in the audience. and we all know that 25% of the attendees at Porcfest are carrying a loaded gun. And I want to reassure people, nobody has ever discharged a gun. They have firing practice, but it's off. It's not on the estate. Nobody's ever discharged a gun there. But anyway, so nobody can arrive with a loaded gun. And Dennis Pratt is in charge, made this declaration: no loaded guns in the audience, because RFK Jr. has demanded that. He's going to have his bodyguards. So there's a lot of pushback from the crazy gun owners. And of course, I tweeted about this. And of course, we libertarians have the usual compassionate response. Not only his father, but his uncle was killed by a gun. So he's got a kind of a problem with that. So why can't we respect it? Apart from that, as Dennis Pratt said, it's our property. You can't appear with a gun. It's property rights. Leave your guns at home. Anyway, so he's appearing. But anyway, I digress because it's a little bit funny. But again, all the stuff he talks about that Bobby Kennedy talks about, Robert Kennedy Jr. talks about, with respect to the lockdowns, with respect to government's wars, with respect to the war in Ukraine. It's great to hear. I completely agree. And if as you indicate, he can actually begin to push, let's say at best, even if you're talking about small victories, push the Biden administration, push voters in the Democratic Party in that direction, that would be wonderful. And if he can convince them of this crazy idea that he's operating in the best spirit of FDR and his uncle JFK,